Imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere around the year 1694. On the western coast of Spain, tucked inside the harbor of A Coruña, a single ship sits at anchor. It has been sitting there for months. The crew hasn't been paid. The captain is drunk below deck. And somewhere on that ship, a man named Henry Every is whispering to the other sailors, planning something that will change pirate history forever. Now pull that map wider, trace a line from Spain, down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. That line stretches over 10,000 miles, and at the end of it, sailing out of the port of Mocha in Yemen, is a fleet of 25 ships belonging to the Grand Mughal of India, the richest man on the face of the earth. One of those ships, the Ganji Sawai, is carrying gold, silver, jewels, and riches worth more than most European nations could dream of. 2 points on a map, 10,000 miles apart. One desperate crew with nothing to lose, one floating treasure vault with everything to take. This is the story of the Fancy, the ship that pulled off the single greatest heist in the entire history of piracy. Not Blackbeard, not Captain Kidd, not even the legendary Sir Francis Drake came close to what Henry Every accomplished in a single night on the Indian Ocean. And the craziest part? He got away with it. Completely. He vanished off the face of the earth with a fortune so massive that it triggered an international crisis between two global empires. But before we get to that night, you need to understand how a middle-aged sailor with no reputation, no wealth, and no ship of his own ended up commanding one of the most successful pirate voyages in recorded history. Henry Every was born sometime around 1659, most likely in the village of Newton Ferrers near Plymouth, England. The exact details of his early life are murky because Every wasn't famous yet. He was just another English sailor in an era when England had thousands of them. Some accounts say he served in the Royal Navy during the 9 Years' War. Others suggest he spent time in the slave trade, working ships that ran between West Africa and the Caribbean. What we know for certain is that by the early 1690s, Every was an experienced mariner. He understood ships, he understood the sea, and he understood something else that would matter a great deal very soon. He understood men. In 1693, a group of English merchants hatched a scheme. Spain was at war with France, and the Spanish government was willing to pay foreign ships to serve as privateers in the Caribbean, raiding French vessels and protecting Spanish interests. The English merchants saw an opportunity. They outfitted 2 ships, the James and the Charles II, and secured a privateer's commission from the Spanish crown. The deal was simple: sail to the Caribbean, attack French ships, and split the profits. Henry Every signed on as the first mate of the Charles II. The captain was a man named Charles Gibson, and from the very beginning the voyage was a disaster. The 2 ships sailed to A Coruña, Spain, in the summer of 1693, expecting to receive their final orders and provisions before heading to the Caribbean. Instead, they sat in port. Week after week, month after month. The Spanish bureaucracy moved at its own pace, and the English merchants who had organized the expedition seemed to have vanished. The crew received no pay. Their provisions ran low. The captain, Gibson, dealt with the stress by drinking himself into oblivion night after night, leaving the day-to-day operations of the ship to his first mate, Henry Every. For months, Every watched the crew grow angrier. He listened to their complaints. He made himself useful. He solved problems. He earned trust. And somewhere along the way, he stopped thinking like a first mate and started thinking like a captain. On the night of the 7th of June, 1694, while Captain Gibson lay passed out drunk in his cabin, Henry Every made his move. He had spent weeks laying the groundwork. Quiet conversations on the gun deck. Promises whispered during night watches. He knew exactly which men were with him, which men were undecided, and which men would be a problem. By the time the signal came, roughly 2/3 of the crew had already pledged their loyalty to Every. The mutineers moved through the ship with practiced efficiency. They secured the weapons locker first, then the helm, then the anchor chain, By the time Captain Gibson stumbled out of his cabin, bleary-eyed and reeking of brandy, it was already over. He was a prisoner on his own ship. Every gave Gibson a choice. Join us, or we put you in a longboat, and you can take your chances rowing to shore. Gibson chose the longboat. So did about 16 other men who either felt loyal to the captain or simply didn't trust what Every was planning. They were lowered over the side in the dark, given enough provisions to reach the Spanish coast, and cut loose. Every stood at the rail and watched the longboat disappear into the darkness. Then he turned to the remaining crew, roughly 80 men, who were now officially pirates. He had a ship, he had loyal men, and he had a plan that none of them had ever heard before. Every renamed the vessel the Fancy. It wasn't a random name. The word fancy in the 1690s carried connotations of desire, ambition, imagination. It was a statement. This wasn't a stolen ship limping home. This was a vessel with purpose, and that purpose was to sail to the Indian Ocean and intercept the Mughal treasure fleet. To understand why the Indian Ocean mattered, you have to understand the economics of the 1690s. The Mughal Empire, ruled at this time by Emperor Aurangzeb, was the wealthiest political entity on the planet. India produced textiles, spices, precious stones, and manufactured goods that the entire world wanted. Every year, a fleet of Mughal ships made the pilgrimage voyage from the port of Surat in western India to Mocha in Yemen, carrying Muslim pilgrims on the Hajj route to Mecca. But these weren't just pilgrim ships. They were loaded with trade goods, gold, silver, and the personal wealth of Mughal nobles and court officials. The annual treasure fleet was one of the richest convoys sailing anywhere in the world, and it was poorly defended. European pirates had known about this for years. But the Indian Ocean was far from the Caribbean and the Atlantic hunting grounds where most pirates operated. The voyage around Africa was brutal. Ships that weren't built for it fell apart. Crews that weren't prepared for it died of disease and starvation. Getting to the Indian Ocean was a voyage in itself. Henry Every didn't care about any of that. In fact, the difficulty of the voyage was part of his calculation. If it were easy, someone would have done it already. Every bet, his life, and the lives of his crew, on the idea that audacity itself was a competitive advantage, he began modifying the Fancy immediately. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. He stripped the upper deck structures to lower the ship's center of gravity and reduce wind resistance. Every unnecessary piece of timber was removed. The ship became leaner, lower, faster. He redistributed the cannon for maximum broadside firepower and drilled his crew on gunnery until they could reload in half the time of a Royal Navy gun crew. At ports along the West African coast, he recruited additional men. Sailors from other ships who had heard about the mutiny and wanted in. Deserters from trading vessels, adventurers who had nothing to lose. By the time the Fancy reached the southern tip of Africa, the crew had swelled to around 150 men. At the island of Johanna in the Comoros Islands, off the coast of Madagascar, Every ordered the Fancy careened. The ship was hauled onto a beach and tilted on its side so the crew could scrape the hull clean of barnacles, weeds, and every bit of marine growth that had accumulated during the long voyage south. A clean hull meant speed, and speed was everything for what came next. He also did something remarkably clever. He wrote a letter. Every composed a letter addressed to the commanders of any English ships he might encounter, assuring them that he was a friend to all English and that he had no intention of attacking English vessels. He promised that any English ship that encountered the Fancy had nothing to fear. He distributed copies of this letter at every port he visited along the African coast. It was, in essence, a public relations campaign. Every understood that the English Navy and the East India Company would eventually come looking for him. By positioning himself as a patriot who only targeted foreign ships, he bought himself goodwill and reduced the chances that English vessels would report his position. The letter worked. English merchant captains who encountered the Fancy along the African coast largely left him alone. Some even traded supplies with him. Every was playing a longer game than most pirates ever attempted. By the summer of 1695, the Fancy had reached the mouth of the Red Sea, the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb, where the Indian Ocean meets the passage to Mocha. This was the choke point. Every ship sailing from India to the Arabian ports had to pass through here, and Every wasn't alone. At the strait, he encountered several other pirate ships that had the same idea. Among them were vessels captained by Thomas Tew, a well-known American pirate, Joseph Farrow, Richard Want, and William May. Every proposed an alliance. They would sail together, share intelligence, and coordinate their attacks on the Mughal fleet. The other captains agreed. For a brief moment in the summer of 1695, Henry Every commanded a small pirate squadron. The Mughal fleet that year consisted of 25 ships sailing from Mocha back to Surat. They had departed Mocha carrying the returning Hajj pilgrims along with an enormous quantity of gold, silver, and trade goods. The fleet was guarded, but not heavily. The Mughals had grown complacent. European pirates had harassed Indian Ocean shipping before, but no one had ever seriously threatened the main treasure fleet. The escorts were lightly armed. The large treasure ships relied more on their size than on their guns. The pirate squadron waited and waited, and somehow the Mughal fleet slipped past them in the night. 25 ships sailed through the strait, and the pirates missed them, except for Henry Every. While the other pirate captains cursed their luck and debated what to do, Every ordered the Fancy to give chase. The Fancy was fast. Every had spent months making sure of that. And now, that speed paid off. After several days of pursuit, the Fancy caught up with the rearmost ships of the Mughal convoy. The first ship they encountered was the Fateh Muhammad, a large trading vessel owned by none other than Abdul Ghaffur, one of the wealthiest merchants in Surat. The Fateh Muhammad put up a fight, but it was outgunned and outmaneuvered. After a 2-hour battle, the ship surrendered. Every's crew swarmed aboard and found a considerable haul: gold, silver, trade goods. By most estimates, the Fateh Muhammad alone yielded somewhere around 50,000 pounds sterling, a fortune by any standard of the era. But Every wasn't satisfied. He knew the real prize was still ahead. The Ganji Sawai was the flagship of the Mughal fleet. The name translates roughly to exceeding treasure. It was one of the largest ships in the Indian Ocean, carrying 80 cannons and a crew of around 400, including a contingent of Mughal soldiers armed with muskets. On board was the personal wealth of one of Aurangzeb's senior court officials, along with Mughal nobles, court servants, and their families returning from the Hajj. On paper, the Ganji Sawai should have destroyed the Fancy. It was bigger, it had more guns, it had more men. Henry Every had around 150 crew members. The Ganji Sawai had nearly 3 times that number. What happened next has been debated by historians for 3 centuries, but the broad outline is clear. The Fancy closed on the Ganji Sawai as the sun rose over the Arabian Sea. Every ordered his gunners to aim for the rigging first, trying to cripple the larger ship's ability to maneuver. The Ganji Sawai answered with a thunderous broadside of its own. And then, something remarkable happened. In the first exchange of cannon fire, one of the Ganji Sawai's own guns exploded on its deck. The barrel split apart, sending shrapnel tearing through the Mughal gun crews. The blast killed several men instantly and wounded dozens more. Panic rippled through the lower decks. Smoke filled the gun ports. Before the Mughal officers could restore order, a second stroke of luck hit. The Ganji Sawai's mainmast was struck by fire from the Fancy, and it cracked, not breaking completely, but lurching at an angle that threw the ship's handling into chaos. Every saw his moment. He brought the Fancy alongside the crippled giant and ordered grappling hooks thrown. The iron claws bit into the Ganji Sawai's railings, and the two ships locked together, hull grinding against hull. Then the boarding began. Evry's men went over the rail with cutlasses, pistols, and axes. What followed was a vicious, close-quarters fight that lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. The Mughal soldiers fought hard. They had muskets and swords, and they outnumbered the pirates by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The decks became slippery with blood. The fighting surged from the main deck to the forecastle to the quarterdeck and back again. But Evry's crew were hardened sailors who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. They fought in coordinated groups, using the narrow passages and stairways of the ship to neutralize the Mughal numerical advantage. They were fighting for the biggest payday of their lives, and every single one of them knew it. The turning point came when the captain of the Ganji Sawai, Muhammad Ibrahim, reportedly abandoned his post on the quarterdeck and fled below deck, hiding among the passengers and the women of the court. Without their captain to rally them, the Mughal defenders lost cohesion. The organized resistance fractured into isolated pockets of fighting, and one by one, Evry's pirates overwhelmed them. When the smoke cleared, Henry Evry and his crew had captured the richest single prize in the history of piracy. The exact value of what they took from the Ganji Sawai has been estimated and re-estimated for centuries. Contemporary accounts vary wildly. The East India Company estimated the total haul at around £600,000 sterling. Some historians have adjusted that figure and placed it somewhere between £200,000 and £400,000. To put that in perspective, the average English laborer in the 1690s earned about £20 a year. Even at the conservative estimate of £200,000, Evry's crew had seized the equivalent of 10,000 years' worth of wages in a single attack. The treasure included gold coins from across the Mughal Empire, silver rupees by the thousands, chests of uncut diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, bales of fine silk and embroidered textiles worth fortunes in European markets, ivory, saddlebags full of spices, and the personal jewelry and valuables belonging to the Mughal nobles on board. One account describes Evry's men scooping handfuls of loose gems from chests in the ship's hold, stuffing them into their pockets and shirts like children grabbing candy. When the plunder was divided among the crew, each man's share came to at least £1,000 sterling. Some estimates put the individual share considerably higher. To put that in human terms, an English sailor in the 1690s earned roughly £12 to £15 a year. A skilled craftsman might earn 20. A comfortable gentleman might have an annual income of £100. Evry's crew members had each just received the equivalent of 50 to 100 years of honest wages in a single night. Overnight, common sailors who had been sleeping in hammocks and eating hardtack became wealthier than most English gentlemen would be in their entire lives. But the capture of the Ganji Sawai was more than just a robbery. What happened on that ship during and after the battle would turn the entire incident into an international scandal. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Contemporary accounts, including testimony from some of Evry's own crew members who were later captured and put on trial, describe scenes of horrific violence aboard the Ganji Sawai after the Mughal defenders surrendered. The pirates tortured passengers to reveal where they had hidden valuables. There were reports of assaults against the women on board, including women of the Mughal court. Several passengers reportedly threw themselves overboard rather than face the pirates. The crew of the Ganji Sawai was brutalized. These accounts were later amplified by Mughal officials in their complaints to the English authorities, and it's difficult to separate fact from political exaggeration. The Mughal court had every reason to make the incident sound as terrible as possible to pressure the English into action. But even accounting for exaggeration, what happened aboard the Ganji Sawai was clearly violent, chaotic, and far beyond a simple robbery. and the consequences were enormous. When news of the attack reached Emperor Aurangzeb in Delhi, the reaction was volcanic. The Ganji Sawai was not just any ship. It flew the Mughal imperial flag. An attack on the Ganji Sawai was, in the emperor's eyes, an attack on the Mughal Empire itself, and the attackers were English. Aurangzeb's fury fell directly on the East India Company. The emperor ordered the arrest of every English merchant and company employee in Surat. The English factory in Surat was surrounded by Mughal troops. Company officials were dragged from their offices and thrown into chains. The governor of Surat threatened to cut off all English trade with India entirely, a threat that would have been financially catastrophic for the company and for England. The East India Company was desperate. Their entire business in India, the most profitable trading relationship in the world at the time, was in jeopardy because of one pirate they had never heard of 6 months earlier. They scrambled to appease the Mughal court. They paid compensation. They made promises. They issued official proclamations condemning every and offering a bounty for his capture. The bounty was £500, later raised to £1,000, one of the largest bounties ever offered for a pirate. The English government launched the first worldwide manhunt in history. Every's name and description were circulated to every English colony, trading post, and naval base around the world. Port authorities from the Caribbean to the East Indies were ordered to watch for the Fancy and arrest any crew members who came ashore. Meanwhile, Henry Every was already running. After leaving the scene of the attack, Every sailed the Fancy across the Indian Ocean to the island of Réunion, then to the island of St. Mary's off the coast of Madagascar, and eventually around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Atlantic. Along the way, crew members deserted at various ports, each taking their share of the treasure and melting into the local population. Every sailed the Fancy to the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, which at the time was a notorious pirate haven. The governor of the Bahamas, Nicholas Trott, was known to be friendly toward pirates, provided they made it worth his while. Every allegedly bribed Trott with the Fancy itself, along with a chest of ivory tusks and other valuables. In return, Trott allowed Every and his remaining crew to come ashore, sell some of their plunder, and disappear. The Fancy was run aground and abandoned. The ship that had carried out the most lucrative act of piracy in history was left to rot in the shallows of a Bahamian harbor. Some of Every's crew bought passage to the American colonies. Others sailed to Ireland. A few headed back to England itself, trusting that they could blend into the population of London or the port towns. Some of them were wrong. Over the following months and years, English authorities tracked down and arrested approximately 24 members of Every's crew. 6 of them were put on trial in London in 1,696 inches, what became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings of the era. The trials were politically charged. The East India Company needed convictions to prove to the Mughal emperor that England was serious about punishing the pirates. The government prosecutors pressed hard. The first trial ended in acquittals. The jury, sympathetic to the sailors and skeptical of company interests, found all 6 defendants not guilty. The government was furious. A second trial was arranged, with different charges and, conveniently, a different jury. This time, 6 pirates were convicted and hanged. Their bodies were displayed in gibbets along the Thames as a warning to other would-be pirates. But the man everyone actually wanted, Henry Every himself, was never found. He vanished completely. There was never a confirmed sighting anywhere in the world, never an arrest, never a trial. Nobody ever found a deathbed confession tucked away in some dusty parish archive, or a skeleton buried in a shallow grave beside a chest of Mughal gold. Not a journal, not a letter, not a single scrap of evidence that told the world where he went. Henry Every, the most wanted man on earth, a man whose name and physical description had been distributed to every English colony, port, and naval station from Boston to Bombay, simply ceased to exist in the historical record after leaving the Bahamas in late 1695. The theories about what happened to him are numerous, and none of them are confirmed. Some historians believe he returned to England under an assumed name and lived out his days in quiet anonymity, spending his fortune gradually enough to avoid suspicion. Others suggest he went to Ireland, where several of his crew members had connections. Daniel Defoe, writing a few decades later, claimed that Every was cheated by merchants in Bristol who took his jewels and gave him nothing in return, and that the greatest pirate of his age died penniless. It's a satisfying narrative, the thief robbed in turn, but there's no real evidence for it. The most romantic theory suggests Every retired to Madagascar, which in the late 1690s was becoming a haven for pirates who wanted to live beyond the reach of European law. Some accounts from the period describe a pirate settlement on Madagascar where former English sailors lived alongside local communities, governing themselves by their own rules. Whether Every was among them is anyone's guess. What we do know is that his story captured the public imagination in ways that no pirate story had before. Within a year of the Ganji Sawai raid, a play called The Successful Pirate was performed on the London stage, dramatizing Every's exploits and portraying him as a dashing rogue who outwitted empires. Broadside ballads about Long Ben. Every circulated through English taverns. Chapbooks told his story to audiences who couldn't read, accompanied by crude woodcut illustrations of the fancy in battle. Henry Every became the original pirate celebrity, the template. Before Blackbeard, before Calico Jack, before Anne Bonny and Mary Read, there was Henry Every, and his legend shaped how the English-speaking world thought about pirates for generations. The image of the swashbuckling pirate captain who seizes impossible treasure and vanishes into the sunset, that's Every's story. Everyone who came after was, in some sense, living in his shadow. But there's a darker dimension to his legacy that rarely gets mentioned in the romanticized versions. The raid on the Ganji Sawai didn't just make Every rich. It reshaped global politics. The diplomatic crisis between England and the Mughal Empire lasted years. The East India Company, humiliated and nearly expelled from India, responded by dramatically increasing its military presence on the subcontinent. They built more fortified trading posts. They armed more ships. They hired more soldiers. The company's transformation from a trading enterprise into a quasi-military colonial power was already underway before Every's raid, but the Ganji Sawai incident accelerated it significantly. Some historians have argued that the raid on the Ganji Sawai was a pivotal moment in the broader story of European colonialism in India. By demonstrating that the Mughals were vulnerable on their own seas, and by forcing the English to militarize their Indian operations, Every's attack contributed, in a small but measurable way, to the eventual British conquest of the subcontinent. It's a stretch to draw a straight line from one pirate raid to the British Raj, but the connection isn't entirely imaginary. The raid also changed how the English government dealt with piracy. Before, every piracy in the Indian Ocean was treated as a distant nuisance. After Every, it became a matter of national security. The English government began investing seriously in anti-piracy patrols, strengthened colonial governors' authority to try and execute pirates, and passed new legislation targeting those who harbored or traded with pirates. The era of casual tolerance for piracy, where governors like Nicholas Trott could openly deal with pirates as long as they got their cut, was coming to an end. Every success had, paradoxically, begun to destroy the very world that made his success possible. And then there's the human cost. The passengers of the Ganji Sawai weren't military targets. They were pilgrims, merchants, families, servants, and courtiers returning from a religious journey. The violence they experienced at the hands of Every's crew was real, regardless of how much Mughal officials may have exaggerated it for political purposes. The romanticized version of Henry Every, the clever rogue who outsmarted everyone, erases the people who paid the price for his fortune. History tends to remember pirates through a very specific lens. The adventure, the treasure, the daring escapes, and every story has all of those elements in abundance. A mutiny in a Spanish harbor, a 10,000-mile chase across 2 oceans, a battle against impossible odds, a vanishing act that no one has ever been able to explain. But history is never just one story. It's layers, And the story of the Fancy is, at the same time, a story about a brilliant and audacious criminal who did something no one thought was possible, and a story about the human wreckage left in his wake, and a story about how one act of piracy sent ripples through global politics that would be felt for centuries. Henry Every was never caught. He was never punished. He never answered for any of it. The Fancy rotted in a Bahamian harbor. The crew scattered to the winds. The treasure disappeared into the economies of a dozen ports across 3 continents. The passengers of the Ganji Sawai went home to tell their stories to families who could never fully understand what had happened. And somewhere, if the legends are right, the most successful pirate who ever lived died in a bed, not on a gallows, not in battle, not in chains. In a bed, under a false name, in a country that was hunting for him, with or without his fortune. No one knows. That's the story of the Fancy. The ship that sailed out of a Spanish harbor with a stolen name and a mutinous crew, crossed 10,000 miles of open ocean, captured the richest prize any pirate had ever taken, triggered a crisis between 2 of the most powerful empires on Earth, and then vanished. 300 years later, we still don't know how it ended.